Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Left Hook Podcast. As always, I am James. I'm joined by my co-host, Geordie.
Thank you.
You're welcome. The hammer of the proletariat, as I like to refer to him as. As always, this is another episode of the Left Hook Podcast, and we're here to counter the mainstream media narrative that is a strong right cross with a strong check left hook. So today we have a lot of content, jam-packed, essentially. We're going to be starting off with some recent developments in Australia. We will then be looking at Australia's contributions around the world, shall we say, to various imperial military endeavours, particularly in Eastern Europe, and then also swinging back to the West Asian continent, where there is a lot more stuff happening there and a lot more horrors that we will be discussing. Geordie, how have you been, my friend?
Good, mate. Thank you for that very crisp introduction.
No worries, mate. That's really what we're here for. A crisp left hook, as always. Yeah. Also, apologies to our audience. It's starting to get pretty warm down here in Adelaide, South Australia. So if either of us start sweating profusely throughout this episode, we apologise. We're working on it. All right, mate.
Well, do you want to take us off? Because there was a state election overnight.
In Queensland.
The results have come in.
Exactly. And well, what's happened, mate, is essentially the Labor government has held power in Queensland for, I believe, the past 9 years or so. And they've essentially lost. It's a pretty narrow margin. They've lost to the Queensland LNP, headed by opposition leader David Crisafulli'S. So originally they were, it was expected that Labor were going to lose by a landslide. Mm-hmm. In the last couple of weeks, however, their popularity has the gap between the two has started to narrow. However, they've still lost by essentially like quite a small margin. I believe it is still, they haven't finished counting the votes. However, they've confirmed as of this morning that the LNP have enough seats to form a government.
Yep.
So pretty much, also interestingly to note, the Greens didn't win a single seat.
Correct.
However, the real hero of Australia, Bob Katter, and the KAP have won 3 seats.
And One Nation didn't get a seat either, did they?
No, I don't believe Pauline Hanson, everyone's favourite suburban racist, did win a seat either, which is interesting because that shows, I guess, how the way the political winds are blowing. So I think what's happened is they have essentially run on a similar campaign to what the country Liberal Party, and they won their last election in the Northern Territory.
Yep.
So Crisafulli has essentially been running on a platform of like a real tough on crime platform, essentially, specifically targeting youth crime. Mm-hmm. So he's been saying if you do adult crime, you do adult time. So again, we'll have to see how that plays out, how that actually kind of affects everyday Queenslanders. It's interesting to note as well that Stephen Miles, who is the now outgoing Labor Premier, so he only took over after Anastasia Palaszczuk, I believe about just under a year ago, 10 months or something like that. He has recently introduced some reforms that were quite popular.
So you mentioned that the Labor Party were catching up in the polls.
I think this is a reason.
After the LNP obviously was forecasted to wipe them out. Mm-hmm. I think it was potentially, as you're about to say, these kind of populist policies that proposed were the reason they caught up in the polls. And they're quite interesting from what I could tell.
They're very interesting because it's pretty basic kind of stuff, but it's the kind of thing that me personally, I think that most state governments should be able to implement for the benefit of the greater population.
Yeah.
So a really important thing they did, which was very popular, was 50-cent public transport fares.
Yep.
So all public transport, the fare was subsidised down to 50 cents, which is good, because that obviously encourages, in my opinion, more people to catch public transport, because obviously it can actually be quite expensive catching public transport, as you would probably know.
I was going to say a fare on the tram here in Adelaide is about $5.
Exactly.
If you haven't got a student card or a concession card.
Or a concession card. So that means that if you're have to catch, say, into the city for work and out, that's $10 a day, times that by 5, $50 a week. You know, it's almost, depending on where you live, you might as well just drive if you have access to parking. So that's really interesting. Mm-hmm. He also, a thing that I really thought was cool was free school lunches for all children.
Yep.
So all children will get a supplied free lunch, which I think is great because, as many people do not talk about in Australia, but there is, I think it's 1 in every 6 children doesn't have enough food to eat. So even though we are a wealthy, prosperous nation, there are lots of people less fortunate. And I think that as well is just going to take ease off parents, take ease off less fortunate families, and obviously ensure basic caloric intake for the poorest people. Yeah. And it's for everyone as well.
Child poverty has been increasing over the past decade. So.
Oh, that doesn't surprise me as well. Yeah. It's funny how, and again, it's funny to even counteract the Liberal Party kind of policy platform. It's almost as if the more inequality, more child poverty you get more crime. Who would have thought? Yeah. I don't know. I don't make policy. I'm not an expert. Just a funny thing.
Well, hang on. I was going to stop you there because you said these were quite standard policies. But I think the next policy you can talk about, in my opinion, is quite radical in the sense that I've never heard of a government doing this here in Australia before.
Not in Australia.
Maybe, possibly, like 50, 60 years ago. The past few decades, I have never heard this ever.
This is unheard of.
It was.
This was unheard of. And I only heard smatterings of it.
Yes.
But in the last couple of weeks.
And it wasn't reported by the mainstream press.
It was not reported by the mainstream press. When I first heard about this, I did an actual double take. I was like, Stephen Miles, what is going on?
I thought potentially that Queensland was going to break away and become like the Soviet Republic of Australia.
Can you imagine? The United Socialist Queensland Soviet Republic.
What was the policy?
Well, the policy was to essentially, they were in discussions and looking at having a state-owned petrol station that would essentially distribute petrol to people throughout Australia and therefore compete in the free market against all the private petrol monopolies and therefore be able to offer a better service and then keep the profits in the hands of the state as opposed to these private monopoly companies, essentially.
And I don't know if people have noticed, but fuel hasn't been heaps cheap over the past years. It's been going up slowly.
It has been increasing quite a bit.
Yeah. And I don't know if people have noticed, but there seems to be a bit of a monopoly in the fuel industry.
Oh, mate.
There's a handful of major, mostly American corporations that run all our fuel stations.
Exactly, and distribute all our fuel.
Correct.
In terms of the actual the ownership of the stations, especially in South Australia, there's it's almost a meme at this stage, but we have the On The Run monopoly.
Yep.
And then we've recently had the X Convenience monopoly, which then competes with them, and there's a few kind of little small fry other kind of small bean competitors. It's a bit different, I think, like in Melbourne and New South Wales, like 7-Elevens and stuff like that, for example. But again, it's still this privately owned, privately controlled fuel distribution network, essentially, at the end of the day. And that allows them to set prices. And just like, for example, as we've seen with basic goods like groceries, the Coles and Woolworths in Australia, they can essentially, one of them can have sales on one day and the other one can not have sales that day, and then they coordinate
and set the prices
themselves. Right. So they're all in cahoots, essentially, and it would have been super interesting and would have set a really interesting precedent to see how that would have played out if that did go ahead. Alas, however, it's not going to go ahead because democracy has worked. The people have spoken, and it's going to be interesting to see whether Crisafulli'S LNP government will make any kind of significant gains for the vast majority of Queenslanders. Very important to note, I think his main contributors and main funders have been fossil fuel companies. So I know he's big on coal. Unlike Scott Morrison, coal does not make me come, so I don't see eye to eye with him on that particularly. But I have heard him say in interviews in the past, stuff like, we're going to obviously make sure there's less regulation for the fossil fuel companies and, allow them to keep essentially raking in massive profits and destroying the environment.
And that's great as we're going through a climate crisis. And
exactly.
And an extinction crisis. But that's what we need, more coal.
More coal, but not even gas,
more oil
dude.
And gas.
Like, take me back to the 1880s, what, coal miners? Like, at least have gas, dude. You know what I mean? At least have rare earth minerals, gas, oil, batteries. You can destroy the environment in a slightly more sophisticated way. Anyways, rant over. It'd be interesting to see what happens in Queensland, mate.
Correct. I was just going to say, it shows you who the big moneyed interests in Queensland are.
Absolutely. And I've always found it funny because Queensland, the kind of joke is for our overseas audience, Queensland's kind of always known in Australia as a very reactionary state. It's a bit like the Florida of Australia. It's always been quite reactionary, and I guess probably had, say, a lot of more kind of racist policies historically, a bit later on, and racist attitudes than the rest of Australia did.
Putting it lightly.
However, at a state level, they've always voted Labor, which is the arguably slightly more progressive option. But like everything, this has swung back the other way. I think the electorate in Queensland has, obviously gotten sick of that government. And that does happen. Governments do stagnate and people do want to change, essentially.
Yeah. It's kind of been the practice in Australia is that we have one government for a couple of terms, and then we get sick of them and switch over to the next one. And then
exactly.
Go back and forth.
And that's the joy of a two-party democratic system. Unfortunately, the KAP, Qatar Australian Party, hasn't won any more seats as of yet, but I will be...
Speaking of just before we move on, speaking of Qatar, he's a very interesting character to say the least. But there was that recent video where he stood up in Parliament in Queensland, and he was holding, I think it was a $5 note with Elizabeth on it.
Yes.
Did you see that video?
I did see that video.
It's quite interesting, and it was a very anti-monarchist little speech he had.
Exactly.
It had a lot of Republican sentiment to it, and he was standing up and he was showing this note, and he was in Qatar style. He was like, "Do you know who this is? This here is Queen Elizabeth."
Yeah. He's a true firebrand, and I don't agree with all his policies. No. He's pretty psychotic. For anyone that doesn't know Bob Katter, any of our international audience, I'll just type up Bob Katter on YouTube. He's an absolute weapon of a man. But I'm the same as you. I do support, he does truly have independent policies. He does not tie himself on any issue to either party consistently. Right. You know what I mean? So he's a bit more conservative, but then again, he comes out and just criticises the Queen. Yeah. He also did a speech in Parliament about what was it? It was trying to save Christianity from the pagan crocodile gods.
It was after the Paris Olympics.
That's right.
And he stood up and he goes, "Have anyone watched the Paris Olympics?"
Like all kind of right-wing reactionaries, that really became, that Paris Olympics opening ceremony really became like a talking point for a little bit, didn't it?
Yeah,
they were just like, this is an attack on Western civilization, an attack on Christianity. And my opinion was, I think maybe kind of postmodern liberal art just kind of sucks as a whole. But they took it the other direction. Yeah. But that's all right, mate. So look, that's one. That's going to be interesting to see play out in the future of Queensland.
Especially because South Australia is going to be having an election next year, and we'll be having a federal election, which we'll be covering. And we're hoping to do some more on-the-ground sort of interviews with people and kind of trying to grasp what public sentiment is going into the next election because it's going to be very close.
Yes.
It's going to be interesting to see what people are voting on coming up to the next
and what
election.
Issues people are voting on, and also how the rest of the media covers it.
That's right.
There is typically, as we all know, and most people know, live in Australia, there's kind of one angle.
Yep.
It might be a kind of a wide angle, but it's a kind of one angle.
It's everyone focus their attention on these issues, and this is what will determine the election.
Yeah, exactly. So, for example, the big thing is like nuclear policy. They've just invented a nuclear policy issue that the coalition are running on.
Correct. And what we've also seen just recently here in South Australia, there was a late stage anti-abortion bill that was narrowly defeated just a couple of weeks ago, and then there was rumours as well that the new LNP Premier and the Liberal Party now in Queensland, there was rumours that they were going to potentially put some restrictions on abortion.
On abortion, yes.
Correct, which was knocked back by the federal Liberal Party because they don't want to take that issue to the federal election.
Of course, because they've also got all the kind of the inner city kind of progressive liberal like boomers essentially that own 3 or 4 properties that are quite wealthy, and they think of themselves as more progressive. And
it's interesting though that we're really going back to like 1980s kind of like Reagan Thatcher economic policy, where it's like just cut any sort of regulation, lower taxes, and we're going to bring up abortion laws again. Wow.
And just really harness that kind of reactionary side. Yeah. And I think I was reading Chomsky a couple of years ago, but he talked about even in the 80s when Reagan brought that up and kind of used it as this divisive political wedge that he started abortion in the 80s. I'm paraphrasing, but Chomsky was saying that this was already in the 60s something that was just done. It wasn't an issue anymore because people were kind of certain. It's a basic health right, obviously. People have their different perspectives on it, but it's a basic right of women's health, and that's the progress of women's liberation as well. But they brought that up again, and it has remained as just a really nasty piece of political tool ever since, which is pretty gross.
Divisive reactionaries don't want to move forwards and actually help build a better society for everyone.
No, of course not.
Keep pulling us back and dividing us.
You never see women pushing these abortion policies. It's always men.
Well, I don't know if you saw most recently in South Australia who was leading the anti-abortion law that was put forward.
No, I didn't.
There was a woman here in South Australia who is a law professor at the University of Adelaide.
Nice.
And we will leave it at that.
Wholesome. Very good.
Yeah.
Well, look, mate, speaking of Australia,
Yeah.
right, so this is going to be interesting going into the future. What else is Australia? Like, if we look at a more broader sense, what is Australia doing overseas right now? Obviously, how are we exerting aid and power overseas, considering there are conflicts going on? There's a lot in kind of a few different parts of the world. We're starting to see fissures. Obviously, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which has been going on for the last 2 years. Got the conflict in Gaza, which is a very decisive issue, and also, obviously, the heating up in the Taiwan Strait.
Correct.
So I know you've been kind of looking at this a little bit, Geordie. Can you inform me as to what our position is? Are we giving material aid?
Yeah.
What side are we on? What are we doing here, mate?
So what I will try and do is give a kind of a broad perspective overview, a bit of a framework of kind of what's taking place in Europe, especially in the Ukraine-Russia conflict. And then we'll be looking a little bit between the tensions between China and Taiwan and Australia's position in that. Going forward, we can speculate what's going to happen, what we're going to do. And then we've got an interesting point of view by Paul Keating, which on this topic, I think he gets very right. So
he's spot on that, man.
Correct. So about a month ago,
mate,
Zelensky, leader of the Ukraine, suggested his 5 points to peace, to ending the conflict.
Yeah. So he has come forward and said, this is my potential plan for peace,
Correct.
One might say. Yeah.
That's exactly right. So in the 5 points, there is most notably, an invitation to join NATO, which, if anyone knows kind of the whole reason for this war, was Ukraine joining NATO in the first place.
Yeah.
It was a major issue for the Russians. So I found that interesting that they're still driving to join NATO.
Yeah. I believe you can't join NATO as well if you're currently in a conflict. I believe that's one of the kind of stipulations.
That's right. The problem is that all the major generals and leaders inside NATO have sort of just kind of rejected this stuff and said, well, not really what we want to do.
So no one's keen on Ukraine anymore?
No one's really keen. And then, so that was the first point. Straight away, the moment I read that, I knew, I said, this is a complete and utter joke. No one can take this seriously. Second one was more weapons faster with less restrictions. So Ukraine now wants weapons to be able to strike deep into Russian territory. And if you have been listening to any of the Russian officials, including Putin, they've said they will take this a lot more seriously because these weapons are coming from the West and they'll be used to strike deep inside Russian territory.
And I believe they've said that would, the way they've changed their kind of military doctrine as well, and that would kind of allow them the framework to strike back at the countries that provided these capabilities.
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's the first 2 points.
Yeah. Sane, and we can work with that. Keep
the
going.
third one was a deterrence, non-nuclear deterrence, which was basically some sort of weapon system from the West that would act as a major deterrence. It hasn't specified exactly what. The third one was strategic economic potential.
Yes.
So the first three are basically just trying to escalate the conflict. It's just like, let's escalate this. Can we have more weapons faster? Can we join NATO? It's not actually any sort of points to peace.
Yeah.
Most notably, there is included in this, there is no dialogue with the Russians, no diplomacy whatsoever.
Yeah.
And usually wars are ended one of two ways. Either one side has an outright victory, or they sit down and there's negotiations.
Yes. Which involves both sides of the conflict.
Both sides. So if you don't have one side of the conflict, you can't actually sit down and have a resolution or a peace agreement. And
well, I'll give them 10 out of 10 for trying.
Yeah. Correct. And even though the press for the past couple of years now have been banging on about kind of a stalemate and huge Russian losses, that's not really the reality.
Yeah.
Ukraine has been bleeding for the past 2 years now, and just in the past 6 months to a year, it's finally shifted in the press. They're now acknowledging this.
Yeah.
And it's looking pretty bleak for the Ukrainians.
Yeah.
In fact, when there was that big incursion into the territories,
into the Kursk region.
Yeah, correct. Or no, prior to the Kursk.
Yes.
So about a year ago, and then there's massive incursions back into the eastern side of the area that Russia had annexed. the Ukraine were in a really good position to actually sit down and negotiate.
Yes.
Even though prior to that there were obviously negotiations, but they were in a good position, and they have now lost that. Russia has a major front line that they are just bleeding the Ukrainians on and are just moving deeper and deeper into Ukrainian territory.
Of course, yeah.
And it's looking bleaker. And as I've said, the Western press has come around and acknowledged this. So they're not in a good position.
No, definitely not.
These kind of three key points, invitation to NATO and more weapons faster, are just a way to kind of escalate it and drag America and its allies into a greater conflict with Russia. It's not a peace plan.
No. Doesn't sound very peaceful.
No, it doesn't. And what was interesting as well was this fourth point here, where it said Ukraine proposes partners from the European Union and US sign a special agreement to a common use of Ukraine's critical resources like lithium, gas, titanium and others, and produce energy together in the future.
That's it. That's what we're waiting for. He said it. He said it.
So now he's just kind of offering the privatization of his country. He's just offering up all of his resources to the West at wholesale prices, so big American firms and corporations can move in and basically just completely pillage the country.
Of course.
Yep.
And I think for people that don't know as well, probably important to note that Ukraine is probably, in terms of a nation, obviously excluding Russia, which is only partially in Europe, Ukraine is probably the most mineral and resource-rich nation in Europe, essentially. I think that'd be safe to say. But also as well, looking at, like you're saying, over the course of this conflict, I think before the conflict they had a population of about 40 million people. I believe about 10 million people have left the country.
And about, look, the numbers are completely contentious. People challenge this, but they say there's at least 500,000 dead and possibly more wounded Ukrainian soldiers now. So it's been a massive battle.
Yeah. And they've also, in supporting Ukraine, it seems to me that the Western nations, like the US or the European nations, they were all so gleefully jumping on board to give them our weapons, which I think was actually more of a political thing. I think it was, it wasn't really because we care about Ukrainian lives so much.
No,
because otherwise we wouldn't have let this happen.
That's right.
But now our stockpiles are depleted. And then with West Asia, which we're going to talk about afterwards, that's even more depleting the US stockpiles of weapons. So that leaves them in a worse position going forwards, correct? Yes.
And our favourite deep state ghoul, Lindsey Graham, had some interesting words about these minerals.
Yes.
He kind of recently just said the quiet part out loud, as US officials do, which is really revealing and interesting when they say this. So we've got this great little piece that we'll play.
They're sitting on $10 to $12 trillion of critical minerals in Ukraine. They could be the richest country in all of Europe. I don't want to give that money and those assets to Putin to share with China. If we help Ukraine now, they can become the best business partner we ever dreamed of. That $10 to $12 trillion of critical mineral assets could be used by Ukraine and the West, not given to Putin and China. This is a very big deal how Ukraine ends. Let's help them win a war we can't afford to lose. Let's find a solution to this war. But they're sitting on a gold mine to give Putin $10 or $12 trillion of critical minerals that he will share with China is ridiculous.
He has to bring China into it as well, doesn't he?
There it is. They're sitting on $10 trillion of minerals and resources that we could use, and quote, I don't want to let them give that to Putin.
Of course.
It's really got nothing to do with the interests of Ukraine.
No.
It's got nothing to do with preserving their sovereignty or finding a peace plan to this conflict. It is, I do not want to give those resources to Russia and China.
Yeah. I love as well the rhetorical shift, because at the beginning there was such a focus on they're a democratic country and we're fighting authoritarianism. And now it's just like, oh, well, look, they've got the minerals. We don't want the other guys to get them, man. That's how it goes. Wow.
Correct.
Lindsey Graham, everyone's favourite neocon.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Goodness.
Yeah. Well, he's good value because he, as I said, he allows to say the quiet part out loud.
I personally find him a hilarious figure.
He
is a hilarious figure. I think he's so deep in the closet he hasn't actually realised yet.
Yeah.
But as well, one other quick point before you move on, I think it'd be interesting to note as well that I believe about a month into the conflict, the Ukrainians had like a kind of a negotiated diplomatic solution that they were prepared to sit down with the Russians to discuss. This is, I believe, in about April 2022, about a month in. At which point, Boris Johnson travelled to Ukraine. And this seems to be the kind of the accepted narrative, and essentially convince Zelensky to not go to terms with the Russians, not find an agreement, and keep fighting because we'll back you all the way.
Correct.
Yes. Yep. So it's funny how now 2 years later, how things have eventuated.
That's right. And since then, they've just slowly been losing the war, and now we're coming up with these kind of deranged points of peace that are just escalations of the conflict and excluding Russia from any sort of peace settlement with them. Of course. So interesting to see where this goes. However, just recently, Australia announced that we are going to send 49 M1 A1 Abrams tanks to the Ukrainians. We will be gifting them. They're valued at $245 million, and we are upgrading our tank fleet. Notably, the M1 A1 Abrams have never seen any battle. They've just been sitting here in Australia. We've just been driving around in the scrub doing skids in them. And now we're going to give them to the Ukrainians and upgrade our entire fleet. And give more money to US military contractors.
Of course, yeah. So not a heaps altruistic gifting of our old parts, like we were saying. It's more just kind of getting rid of the old stuff, in with the new stuff.
Correct. Yeah. And on top of that, we have so far provided them with $1.3 billion military aid and another $1.5 billion in financial aid as well. It's about a $3 billion commitment at the point.
Yeah, wow. Yeah. So obviously not anywhere near what the US has given.
No, of course
the insane amounts of money the US has poured into it. But.
Yeah, that's right. And I just also would notice that the Minister for Defence and Industry, the Honourable Pat Conroy, will be going to the NATO Defence Ministers meeting in Brussels in the coming month as well to show our steadfast commitment to supporting Ukraine.
Australia, a true Northern Atlantic partner.
Correct. What I think is interesting about this is it really shows the disconnect between Australian politicians and Australian kind of establishment and what's going on in the rest of the world.
Absolutely, yeah.
We sort of don't kind of read what's going on. We don't understand the big shift in America amongst the Republicans, most notably Trump and not just Trump, amongst a huge segment of the population that don't want to keep supporting this war, that want to find a peace settlement. And I don't think Australia really understands that, because here in Australia, on both sides of politics, we have steadfast support. We have all the standard accusations of, Putin, the dictator, the authoritarian leader. We must stand up for democracy, But we just completely don't. Inside our political discourse, at a national level, we just miss what's going on in the rest of the world.
Yeah,
there's a big shift away from supporting this and a shift towards trying to find a peace settlement.
Yeah. So that's interesting. I guess like all kind of US vassal states like Australia and the UK, I guess we're kind of a little bit late to the party. We're going to keep running along even after they've kind of turned around. We're going to kind of keep pushing it just that little bit further, I guess, and just going for it just a little bit harder, I guess.
I would say the only dissent that we've seen in Australia on this conflict, I saw on Sky News from Bernard Corey. Who was a former Liberal MP who then started his own Conservative Party, which failed here in South Australia. That's the only dissent I've seen from a politician in Australia.
Wow.
Was coming from the kind of loony fringes of the right wing on Sky News. Yeah, which I found that very fascinating.
But it's interesting as well, because I think the way this is kind of metastasized politically in America as well is that there is a part of the kind of anti-establishment right and a part of the anti-establishment left that are both kind of united on this one issue, which I've seen, which is quite interesting. And the rest of the kind of the centre, shall we say, the extreme centre, shall we say, are kind of still in support for it. But obviously the tides are starting to shift slowly. But I do find that interesting as well.
And I'll just add, in addition to the military support, there has been a operation called Operation Kudu. Operation Kudu. So this is Australia's commitment alongside the British to training Ukrainian military personnel inside Great Britain. So we've sent a contingent from the Defence Forces here in Australia to train Ukrainian soldiers in Great Britain. So far we've trained about just over 2,000 of them, which if you look into any of the independent analysis on the battle, 2,000 troops goes a couple days in the conflict at the moment, maybe a week at most.
Wow.
So it is pissing in the wind in the big scheme of things. And I was going to ask you as well, I think there was an interesting little anecdotal story that we heard from someone.
Yeah, I've heard that there are people that are getting trained. As you said, we do have military personnel that are training Ukrainians. And from what I've heard, it seems to be I wouldn't necessarily say a piss take, but the way that it has been structured and it's going about the training is that it would just never be the sufficient amount. Like, I'm not sure what it is in Australia, but obviously from joining the armed services to like actually being in like some sort of combat position, that'd take minimum like months, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Just to learn the basics.
Yeah.
Obviously there is quite a lot of stuff to learn. Obviously, like, discipline, heaps of theory, weapon safety, etc., etc. And to my knowledge, they're just kind of churning them around in like a couple weeks at a time.
And these are conscripts.
Yes, yeah, they don't want to be there. The Ukrainians don't want to be there, as well as the kind of, obviously you have language barriers, you have to get translators involved. So the whole thing becomes kind of a messy process.
The program was a couple of weeks? 2 weeks?
I believe it's about 2 weeks or something, so from what I've heard. So
taking these Ukrainian conscripts, shipping
some of them are prisoners as well.
Shipping them over to the United Kingdom, giving them 2 weeks training by Australian personnel. That baffles me. Obviously. And then sending them back to the front line as cannon fodder.
Yeah, man. Yeah. And again, lots of them getting minced up.
Yeah.
It's
really sad, to be honest.
Well, it is. It's awful because
and it also shows Australia's commitment and NATO's commitment and their strategy to just prolong this conflict as long as possible.
Yeah, and who obviously benefits are the weapons contractors.
Correct.
Ding, 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 ding.
And, as I say, and the donators to the political establishment in America who are going to get all these minerals and resources.
Of course, provided they can pull it off, and it doesn't look like they're going to be able to pull it off.
No,
I don't think they're going to be able to pull this one off, unfortunately.
Correct.
Yeah. Well, look, real depressing.
Yeah.
Real depressing stuff. I think as well there is actually like the Ukrainian as a from what I've heard, analysis from kind of a whole bunch of different points of views, it is getting to the stage where the military apparatus as a whole just isn't really working anymore. It's that disjointed. There's that much dissension. There's that much dissent. There's been that much carnage.
Of course.
There's that, again, the support, even though we're talking about how much support they've been given, it's just not enough. There's just not the industrial capacity in the West to keep this going.
Of course not.
So I guess in terms of looking at it personally from the outlook that I would think would be the most humane one would just be to end it. And regardless of what the political outcome is, just stop this insane level of slaughter.
That's right.
Yeah.
Speaking of conflicts, there's tensions of a conflict a little bit closer to home that Australia will be much more directly involved in, and that is the tensions between China and Taiwan. And there's been really interesting developments over the past fortnight.
Yes, definitely.
So a fortnight ago, there was the biggest military encirclement around Taiwan by China.
By China, yes.
Correct.
Yep.
So I noticed that this was kind of missed in the mainstream press here. For about a day, it sort of simmered and then sort of got pushed under the rug. So obviously everything that's going on in the Middle East.
Yep.
But this came after remarks from the Taiwanese leader who said that it was basically, he had remarks of Taiwan's kind of independence and sovereignty and that it would deter any sort of aggression,
Yep.
And then the next day there was this huge military build-up around the island and it included 34 naval vessels.
Yeah, so this is the Chinese Navy.
Yeah, including their aircraft carrier.
Yeah,
which is kind of it's the only aircraft carrier that can compete with the US.
Yeah,
they have 3 of them. Obviously, the US I think have about 12. And so there was 34 naval vessels and 125 aircraft, and they basically from east to west, north to south, encircled the whole island and had live fire drills, and it was basically a way of showing that we can blockade the island indefinitely. And it's interesting because this is a conflict Australia will be involved in.
Yep.
This is what AUKUS is all about.
Yeah.
Just the other day it was announced that we are going to receive about 200 Tomahawk missiles, which are major long-distance missiles produced by the US. So we will be one of 3 countries, including the US, obviously, and Britain, that have these missiles. They are long-distance missiles. They are used to strike deep into an adversary's territory. They're not to defend our nation state. And this kind of the whole blockade and everything as well, it's a contentious point because what I understand about Taiwan is that Australia adheres to the One China policy. We recognise Taiwan as a part of China.
So this is our official foreign policy stance.
Correct.
Is that we recognise that Taiwan is a part of China.
Yes.
Yes. All right.
So in the instance that China was to deploy troops into Taiwan, kind of becomes a contentious point.
It does.
Because really it is part of technically their sovereign territory.
Yep.
However, obviously there are a part of the population in Taiwan and political forces that reject this. Mm-hmm. Obviously the West is pushing to kind of accept this and support it as well. Except as the historian Alfred McCoy points out, is that a whole majority of the rest of the world doesn't see it this way. Mm-hmm. And then in fact they see Taiwan as a part of China in one way or another, and they would see basically the Chinese military as kind of occupying a part of its own sovereign territory.
So they'd essentially view this as a domestic issue.
Correct.
Yes.
They'd view it as a domestic issue that the West is trying to get involved in. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the United States sends billions of dollars weapons to Taiwan, gives them massive military packages, and I think it's just recently been training about 20,000 troops in America.
Yep.
So it's obviously the United States superimposing itself into a kind of Chinese Asian domestic issue.
Of course.
And Australia is supporting that. And that's what Peter Dutton said recently, that he said it was inconceivable for Australia not to support the United States if it was involved in a conflict with China over Taiwan.
Yes.
Which means Australian troops will be deployed onto the beaches of Taiwan and the surrounding islands to fight the PLA, the Chinese military.
That sounds like a terrible idea.
Yeah.
It's interesting as well that the framing of this... Again, in the kind of what Dutton's saying, what the mainstream kind of the accepted mainstream narrative is, that it's not, there's no room for negotiations.
Yeah.
It's not like we're talking about, we have to work constructively with China to solve this issue. It's that we will support America when this happens. So it doesn't seem like an if, and there doesn't seem to be the possibility of an if in the discourse. It just seems to be when it's going to happen.
Yes, correct. And this, the whole point about this that people sort of miss is that in modern kind of like political discourse, to define a state, you have to have a couple of things. You have to have a defined territory and population, and a sovereign military and government, and external recognition.
Yes.
Taiwan has a defined population, territory, a sovereign military and government, but it lacks recognition.
Of course.
So it's not recognised in the United Nations. The United States does not recognise it, and neither does Australia.
So why the hell, mate... As a bloody common sense Aussie here, why the hell are we going to send our boys to die for Taiwan? For the same patch of dirt that we recognise as being a part of China?
If there is obviously one way of saying it, it's that it's at the behest of the interests of the United States.
Of course.
And the other way that it's framed here in Australian discourse is that we are deterring Chinese aggression in the Indo-Greater Pacific region and deterring China from...
Really stretching the definitions of the regions. The Indo, Asia, South, East, West, Pacific, Northern Atlantic.
Correct. And obviously deterring China from further expansion.
Yes.
Even though technically we recognise as a part of its sovereign territory, which gets, once again, a little bit sticky.
Do you remember the 2003 Chinese invasion of Iraq?
No, I don't.
Neither do I. Sorry, please continue.
So I think who has kind of summarised this issue the best is our former Prime Minister, Paul Keating, who was leader of Australia during the 1990s. Obviously, on some issues I don't agree with, but I would still argue kind of is one of our best leaders because he had a vision of Australia as an independent, sovereign country.
He was also like an intelligent man and a statesman. And a statesman, sorry.
So I would argue that potentially our last statesman.
Yes.
That's kind of my opinion.
Yeah.
Obviously, people sort of put forward Kevin Rudd, and he also is a very intelligent man.
Very
He's just recently done a PhD in political science. Obviously, can speak Chinese fluently, has been in and out of government, is the ambassador to the United States at the moment.
Yeah.
Also a very intelligent man. I do see him as a statesman, but I would argue that Paul Keating was our last greatest statesman, could think independently, didn't kind of fall into the sort of US main kind of narrative and then obviously he's repeating it, actually thought on his own 2 feet.
Yeah.
And I think he has summarised this conflict really well recently on an interview in the 7:30 report. So we'll play that and have a look at that.
All right.
So let me just stop there on the Chinese real estate. What about Taiwanese real estate and the wishes of the Taiwanese people?
Yeah, well, the Chinese real estate is part of China. Let me make the analogy. It would be like the Chinese saying to us, look, we think Tasmania has been forgotten and poorly treated for many years. We want to keep the sea route down the east coast of Australia, through Bass Strait, across to Perth and the Indian Ocean open. So we're going to put some frigates there, and we will economically support the Tasmanian people should they wish to secede from Australia. We'd say, look, that's shocking.
Let's just stay with Taiwan for the moment, because the Chinese have said that they will, by taking back Taiwan, to use their phrase, they would dismantle all of Taiwanese civil society. Are you prepared to just see all of that gone?
Taiwan is not a vital Australian interest. Tasmania would be, if it was us. We would fight anybody touching Tasmania, like the Chinese will fight anyone touching Taiwan. You see, the thing is this, Sherry, you've got to understand this. The Chinese will fight to the last teenage soldier to defend Taiwan and the Chinese state, and the Americans will not take on such a fight, and more than that, will not win it. So we end up being, we get the carry-on rights, and all of a sudden the Americans take off and leave us, and we're the ones that have done all the offence. You know what I mean?
Let me just come back to the...
Very interesting point.
2 points there. Mm-hmm. It is a vital Chinese interest, and they will defend it to the last man, as we would with Tasmania if it was reversed. And he, prior to that, also talks about the fact that the US is superimposing this conflict into the area by putting its frigates and military in the South China Sea and in between the Taiwan Strait and China.
Of course.
So, and what I think the woman interviewing Keating misses here, and this is kind of the key thing, is that without America superimposing themselves there and brewing these tensions, this conflict would most likely see itself out in some sort of economic and diplomatic manner.
And there wouldn't be like a straight up military confrontation.
That's what's missed out of all of the conversation. And what Keating points out there at the end is that the United States, in the likely outcome that the conflict goes south of them or that there's a stalemate, they will just simply piss off. Yeah. And we will be stuck here to deal with the consequences.
Pick up the pieces, which is fantastic.
What is always missed here in any of the discourse, just completely, they just wash over it.
Yeah.
They just don't even acknowledge the fact that America, like all the other conflicts, let's go look back at Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, what's potentially going to happen in the Ukraine, they will just
wipe their hands of it.
They'll wipe their hands off and move on to the next military.
And then the populations there will have to deal with it.
Yeah, and we are part of that population.
Exactly. I think it's one thing that this brings to mind with me is I remember after when COVID first kicked off, and then Scott Morrison came out and made some inflammatory remarks towards the Chinese about the origins of COVID and kind of. It wasn't really...
Banned Huawei.
Yeah, it wasn't really necessary. But in response, I remember China, and I'm pretty sure the SEPOs, for foreign viewers, SEPO is short for septic tank, which rhymes with yank because they're all full of shit, just like a septic tank. So the SEPOs, the Americans, I'm pretty sure were pushing Scotty to kind of do it. You know, I think there was a bit of a push to get him to stand up and make these statements. And they obviously cut a whole bunch of luxury imports.
Yes.
Which affected massively Australia's export market.
Barley,
wine, lobster. Another big one was coal. Right, they stopped taking in a whole bunch of our coal.
Correct.
And who picked up the tab and started exporting coal to them? The Americans. So these people are not our friends.
That's right.
And that is something that we have to remember.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, I was just going to add, after with this huge missile deal, this multi-billion-dollar missile agreement.
The Tomahawks?
Yeah, it's not just Tomahawks. There's a whole range of different missile systems for our Navy and our Air Force. I think it's to the tune of about $7 billion we'll be giving the SEPOs. There was a bit of dissent recently about the whole AUKUS agreement.
Yeah.
Inside the Labor Party here, which in previous conflicts, especially in Vietnam, there's always been a kind of a section of the ALP that just sort of see some sort of reason in this, that just don't want us to be going along in America's imperial adventures.
Yep.
And there, most recently, at this meeting, there was some dissent over AUKUS, and that there was a motion pushed to not recognise AUKUS as a accepted main pillar for the Labor Party, which was steadfastly rejected by Albanese and the leadership. And obviously Albanese said that there's no security in isolation. Yeah. And I would argue and say, well, there's no security in...
like confrontation.
In confrontation alongside the United States.
Yeah.
Whatsoever. And this was interesting. The Defence Industry Minister, Pat Conroy, who argued during the conference AUKUS debate that opposing AUKUS was akin to supporting calls for appeasement during World War II. When the British appeased Hitler.
Of course. Of course. They love bringing it back to
They always
love bringing it back
it back to the moustache man.
Yeah,
every single time.
Every single
or
time.
some sort of, appeasement pact or...
Oh, you're appeasing Hitler. Yeah, wow. Goodness. Yeah. All right. Well, I think they've missed the historical note that, like, at that stage, most of the British ruling class is kind of on his side, I think. But we'll let that one slide for the time being. Yeah.
Really poor history. A terrible analogy, honestly. Just freaking shocking.
But it does... But now that you mention that, of course, I have seen... Again, when AUKUS was first announced, and here at Left Hook, I reckon that was the first video he did.
That was
about
our first
AUKUS.
Video, I will keep bringing it back to AUKUS. I'm sorry, because this is not going to leave us.
No, and it's such a pivotal issue.
Yeah.
But I think as well... lots of people and lots of like qualified people and people way smarter than myself in the public sphere have kind of come out and said that this isn't a good, it's not going to work. No. Not because they don't necessarily think it's not a good idea, but because they just talk about logistically in terms of actually like the capacity that the US has to supply us and where things are going to be in a couple of years' time and just the logistics of setting up the bases and the subs and stuff as well.
Yeah,
so obviously I think the rhetoric of the kind of undying support for the US alliance is still there, but in the way it's going to materialise itself, that seems to be accepted that might start shifting.
Well,
different things.
Gareth Evans, who was the foreign minister under the Hawke government, correct? I believe so.
Yeah,
99% sure.
Yeah.
He has been the most recent person to come out and say that we're not going to have sovereignty over these submarines and just listed off how this is just an atrocious idea.
Of course. And Hawke was like a massive US ally.
Correct.
You know what I mean? It's not like they weren't...
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not like they weren't massive allies.
It's not you and I just sitting here in this room banging on about it. This is a major issue.
Far out, man.
Yeah. All right, well...
Should we move on?
Yeah, let's move on.
Speaking of expansionist powers...
So it feels like every time that we meet and do this podcast, there has been a major escalation in the Middle East.
There has been a major escalation. There's been a series of escalations. The escalator is running at full capacity, straight forwards and upwards. Mm-hmm. But before we talk about some recent stuff that's happened that I wanted to note, I want to just look at some stats, some very basic stats here for the audience, because it has been over a year since the most recent kind of iteration of the conflict has kicked off after October 7th with the Hamas incursion into Israel to essentially capture prisoners, to take back, to hold hostage, to then essentially use that as a bargaining tool to free the thousands of Palestinian prisoners illegally held captive in Israel, and what has happened since. So I got this from an Al Jazeera article. These statistics, so just let me read some of them off to you. And these are about 2 weeks old, I'd say, at this stage. So just important to note, these aren't the most recent stats. And even then, they're the best ones we can get, but I don't think they'll be 100%
Run me through it.
So in Gaza, and this isn't counting Lebanon or Syria or anything else. In Gaza, we've had over 42,500 people killed. 16,500 of them were children. We've had more than 99,500 people injured and more than 10,000 people missing under the rubble. Now, I want to also note that, as we reported previously, when counting, these are like direct deaths that we know of, considering there's no civil or public health infrastructure really remaining in Gaza. And so that's a base number that we have. And as well, the Lancet, it's essentially kind of commonly accepted that for every direct death, you're going to have between 3 and 15 additional deaths. Yep. So if we use a very conservative estimate of, say, 5 to 1, which I think given the circumstances is quite conservative, we can extrapolate the death toll to over 200,000. However, it could be higher than 500,000. In the West Bank, there have been at least 757 people killed, with 165 of them being children, and over 6,250 people injured. Again, these are old stats. I think there's been a massive increase of settler violence in the West Bank in the last few weeks. That number's probably higher. In the proper Israel proper, or Greater Occupied Palestine, we can say, death toll has been revised from October 7th down to 1,139 people killed and at least 8,730 people injured. I will note these stats do not include the latest IDF casualties that we've seen in southern Lebanon, where they have really been essentially facing really fierce resistance in the south of Lebanon. I believe in the past couple of days it's been reported like 50 Israeli soldiers have died. We've had tanks being taken out. It's not looking good for them either. According to the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, the WHO, and what it remains of the Palestinian government, the attacks by Israel have damaged or destroyed over 50% of Gaza homes, 80% of commercial facilities, 87% of schools. There's only 17 of 36 hospitals that are even partially functioning, 68% of roads destroyed, 68% of farmland destroyed. Every hour in Gaza, 15 people are killed, 6 of them being children, 35 people are injured, and 42 bombs are dropped, and 12 buildings are destroyed. These are all conservative estimates. That is absolutely horrible.
Can I just stop you for a second?
Yes.
After that little summary that you gave us,
I've got more. There's more horror coming.
Correct. But what I was going to say, from that just mass destruction of Palestinian society, of infrastructure and people, that is mainly what the ICJ, International Court, is using to accuse Israel of genocide with, and what most people that use that word genocide will point to these statistics as evidence of a genocide, and not just a war and collateral damage.
And obviously it's not just about the killing of individuals, but it's about the destruction of any means of life and what makes life in a society livable.
The wholesale destruction of a society.
Yeah, based on ethnic, religious, whatever, classifications, which, again, there's no European Jews being killed amongst these people in Palestine. Please continue. More than 125 journalists have been killed, which is insane. That number has, again, gone up since then because I've seen more people have died in the last couple of weeks. At least 120 of them were Palestinian, 3 Lebanese, 2 Israelis. Over 190 UN staff have been killed. Highest death toll, I'm pretty sure, for UN aid workers ever.
Yep. Most journalists killed in a conflict.
Yep, most journalists killed in a conflict ever. 100 aid workers have been killed, additionally on top of that.
Yep.
This is where it gets really messed up. From October 2023 to June 2024, Israel has dropped over 70,000 tonnes of bombs on Gaza. That's to June. We're in October now. So we've got another, 4 months after that. 70,000 tonnes of bombs. This exceeds the tonnage of bombs dropped in the Second World War on London, Hamburg and Dresden combined. This is the equivalent to over 4 Hiroshimas. The little boy atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima, which was the smaller one, had a yield of 15 kilotons, 15,000 tonnes. This is over 4 little boys.
Yep.
So that data is just for Gaza. That does not include Lebanon, where we've seen wholesale destruction of Beirut and southern Lebanon. We've had over 2,000 civilians killed in Lebanon. This does not include Syria, where there are repeated attacks against Syrian government infrastructure by the Israelis. This does not include the Anglo-American bombing campaign against Yemen, against the Ansar Allah government in Yemen, who have been also restricting trade to Israel. Important to note, Israel's economy has shrunk by approximately $70 billion since last year, since before the war, mainly due to what I would consider pretty insane moves taken by the Ansar Allah government in Yemen to just block shipping going to Israel, because under international law, if there is a genocide taking place, it is your obligation to do what you can to stop that from happening.
R2P, right to protect.
Right to protect, yes. Can you imagine Samantha Power or Victoria Newland trying to do the mental gymnastics to not apply that logic here? I just would not see it. Really important to note that as things have heated up in Lebanon, we have seen, and the media focus has shifted away, we've seen some of the heaviest bombing in Gaza to date. Wholesale destruction. We've seen, as of the last week or two, we've seen essentially the Israeli government has come out and said that they in no uncertain terms, it's essentially going to be an ethnic cleansing of the northern section of the Gaza Strip, where they've said every male is going to be, they've told all the women and children to get out. They've said every single male in this northern section, I don't have an exact map on me to demonstrate, is going to be considered essentially like a militant. We have seen, as I saw earlier today, I saw an aid worker on the internet talking about how essentially The desalination plants have all just whatever little water facilities there were have been completely stopped. I have seen footage of men being rounded up, handcuffed, blindfolded in press gangs and let out together, which is not something you typically see the good guys doing in a war.
No.
I think it's really important to note that this is the little scraps that we're seeing.
Yep.
The things that we are not seeing are far, far worse. This is being reported every day by everyday Gazans.
There's 2 points there I find interesting.
Yep.
At the beginning there, you mentioned the statistics of the bombs. Mm-hmm. And it's what Norman Finkelstein has said, that this is a genocide from afar. Mm-hmm. Is that the IOF, the Israeli occupation forces, aren't going in and just shooting people.
No.
This isn't like systematic where people are getting rounded up and sent to gas chambers. This is just carpet bombing from afar.
Yep.
The military sits back and they just send in their fighter jets and they just bomb civilian infrastructure. Just indiscriminate bombing. Joe Biden even described it as indiscriminate bombing, where they just bomb every civilian building. And as you mentioned, obviously schools and hospitals.
Yes.
And so this is really, as Finkelstein said, a genocide from afar.
From afar, absolutely. And this actually did did receive a lot of heat about 2 weeks ago, a week and a half ago.
And just at the end there, when you mentioned about the footage that we're seeing, that's just the footage that is coming from either the occupation forces, soldiers filming their own atrocities, or from the mobile phones that Palestinians have managed to hold on to.
Yes.
And have managed to actually get these videos out into the world for people to see.
It's also important to note as well, we don't have, if you're a Gazan, you're seen with a phone recording, you're shot instantly. So we're not seeing...
Or at least detained and beaten and taken off you instantly.
They're not going to risk... The IOF aren't allowing people to just film things.
No, of course
you know
not.
what I mean?
Yeah.
That's right. One thing that was filmed that was absolutely horrific was when they bombed the Al-Aqsa hospital in Gaza, which triggered a fire, which swept through the hospital, which sounds like a tent hospital, essentially, in like a makeshift camp. And the blaze was captured on video. And we saw, I think lots of people who are paying attention to this conflict, we saw a man laying in a bed, burning to death with an IV drip still in his arm. Horrors beyond comprehension. And even this kind of elicited a response from Joe Biden. I'm going to talk about Joe Biden afterwards. Okay. Funny stuff.
That footage you mentioned
did
go viral. Yes. I saw the ABC here obviously played it, and a bunch of other media outlets, and even people who I spoke to that aren't really up to date on this conflict saw it on their social media, because it's something that can't be hidden.
No.
You can't sweep this under the rug.
And it's disgusting. It's truly horrific.
This is a man.
It's the kind of thing.
This is a man sitting inside a hospital that has the right to healthcare.
Yep.
To be taken care of.
Mm-hmm.
He's not a military combatant.
He'd already been displaced.
Correct.
I believe.
And he's being bombed and set on fire.
Yeah. It's awful. And this is...
What else do you say?
Yeah, and this is just a fraction of what we have seen. It's important to note, when you're talking about genocide from afar, that, and again, this is kind of their strategy in Lebanon as well, but we've talked about this before, I'm not a soldier, in the immortal words of Alexander Makuris, I'm not a military man.
Yes.
However, it does appear that they can't actually make concrete progress on the ground, because despite all this destruction in Gaza, they still are fighting Hamas. Hamas actually is getting a higher kill count of Israeli soldiers and tanks now than they have been at any other time in the war. Same in Lebanon. Nothing can be... that's all they can do is just bomb the civilians. They don't know how to do it. I think your average conscripted Israeli soldier, vape shop owner from Tel Aviv who's did military service 3 years ago and they've called him back up, he was probably just harassing old women and kids at checkpoints in the West Bank for 2 years. They don't know how to fight against people who are fighting for their very existence. Nothing, I think, personifies this more than the recent death of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar. He obviously, after the death of Ismail Haniyeh in Iran, which we have also talked about, Yahya Sinwar was, again, essentially took the leadership of Hamas, essentially. And he has always been a fighter. He's kind of born in, essentially, under occupation, lived his entire life under occupation. He was jailed in an Israeli jail as a younger man for essentially killing Palestinian collaborators, because there's always has been a kind of people who, via either they're blackmailed or they're coerced, but they are willing to collaborate with the occupation forces and trade intelligence and stuff like that. He was put in an Israeli jail. He taught himself Hebrew, reads and writes Hebrew. He is, I think, was a very intelligent person, and he very much understood the enemy that he was fighting.
Yep.
He was killed on the 16th of October, and it wasn't a precision assassination. It shows for all the intelligence they claim they have and all the intelligence that we provide for them, the way he was killed was essentially he was on the front lines in Gaza with a handful of troops that were his bodyguard, and they sighted an Israeli patrol and engaged an Israeli patrol, which had a tank. There was some fighting. To my knowledge, I've read a couple different reports that differ slightly, but overall, the picture that is painted is a tank round fired into the building, killed all the guys with him. He was still alive. He ran to a different section of the building, and I'll explain how we know this in a second. And there he was filmed by an Israeli quadcopter drone. We could play the footage, but it's probably not a good idea. It was filmed, essentially flew up to scout out the building, do reconnaissance, and you can see Yahya Sinwar. It looked like he was missing his right hand, covered in rubble, covered in dust, with a keffiyeh wrapped around his face. And the last thing he did, and you can see this on the drone, he picks up a stick and he throws it at the drone. Yep. So this man is the leader of Hamas, of the whole organisation, and he is dying fighting. This is really important to note because the IDF published this footage, and I think the intention for them was to get a propaganda victory and say, because I've looked online, read the comments, and lots of the kind of pro-Zionist comments are saying, he died like a coward, rah, rah. I think it's quite funny that he literally died on the front lines fighting, and not only has there been a backlash, but it's galvanised lots of people, in the resistance community, shall we say, to fight even harder, because they've saying, look, what the guy that was our leader, he wasn't in a hotel room in Qatar. Yeah. He wasn't hiding in a tunnel somewhere. He was out on the front lines.
That's what you're saying. It really runs contrary to the image that's put up here in the West, especially by the Israelis, that the leaders of Hamas are these kind of cowards hiding amongst the population in tunnels, under hospitals, etc. When contrary to that, the death demonstrates how, quite often they are on the front lines fighting occupation.
Occupation, exactly.
That's right.
And I think the reason they released this footage is because one of the soldiers, in classic Israeli soldier professionalism, he took photos of the dead body of Sinwar and then sent them to his girlfriend. And I think she shared them around. And
she shared them to the Israeli press, I think it was on an Instagram.
Something like that.
On an Instagram page,
real healthy behaviour. Anyways, the IOF, the Israeli occupation forces, decided to get ahead and claim the propaganda victory, which is, I think, why they released the video. However, it has completely backfired.
Yes.
This kind of leads you to the same logical conclusion, leads the rational observer to the logical conclusion. If they continue to keep killing the leadership, then who are they going to negotiate with?
Yes, that's right.
It's that same issue that we're talking about with Zelensky earlier.
Yeah.
And I had a piece, I had a bit of an article here by the ABC, and they talked about, look, I'm quoting, pardon me, sorry. Its government may see no reason to stop now, even though Israel is yet to turn these military wins, into political and diplomatic progress.
Yep.
So even the ABC is admitting, look, they have these small, minor military wins, but that isn't getting us any closer to a diplomatic solution. Which leads me to the logical conclusion that we've been talking about the entire time. They do not want a logical solution. No. They want the expulsion of the Palestinian people and then the creation of the greater Israeli state.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And as you briefly mentioned, their actions of just trying to decapitate the leaders of these groups just runs contrary to actually finding a peace agreement or getting any of the hostages back, which is meant to be the goal.
Yeah, and that's meant to be the goal, and I think it proves as well that it's not the goal. No, it's not their goal.
It's definitely not.
It's not their goal. So. In response to the footage of that young gentleman burning to death in hospital, Joe Biden came out and he actually said, we are going to, he's like, look, what's happening is so full on and so horrific. We're going to impose an arms embargo on Israel. I believe they wrote a letter penned to the Zio regime Defence Minister Gallant. Blinken and Lloyd Austin demanded that unless there was action undertaken to ease the humanitarian crisis, the US would have to start taking punitive steps laid out in US laws and policies which supposedly restrict supply of aid to regimes that facilitate humanitarian crises. While these laws have existed the entire time, they have only decided to act on it now. And it's the best part of this. He goes, in 30 days, we will start considering it. 30 days is after the election.
Yes.
So what is going to happen after the election? Well, it's obviously just a very cheap pandering to the domestic political audience, especially Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, and young people who are really sickened by their government's support for this ongoing genocide. Also, as well, it leaves it completely up in the air. So I've formulated 4 possible things that will happen based on my analysis. So either the Democrats win the election and just reassert their undying support for the Zionist regime. The Republicans win the election and they reassert their undying support for the Zionist regime. The election results are completely irrelevant. Israel manufactures a WMD false flag operation to justify expanding the war against Iran, in which case the US government will oblige. Or Israel will escalate against Iran disproportionately, which will cause a massive reaction by Iran, and the US government will be obliged. That is my take on the situation. I think I'd like to see none of those things happen, but I think that is what will happen.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that comprehensive report.
No worries, man. I've got more to go. We're not over yet. There is more to talk about, though. We've seen, obviously, more further escalations in Lebanon. We've also seen, this is breaking news, I believe this is yesterday morning I woke up and I checked the news and I found out about this. Israel actually launched a strike against Iran.
Yep.
It doesn't seem like this I don't really take either side's media as completely trustworthy. However, it seems like they launched a very limited strike. The majority of it was intercepted by Iranian integrated air defense. I think the purpose of this strike was to essentially use it as kind of a probing attack to, again, see how the Iranian air defense system works, seeing where their batteries are located and seeing what the response is like. And I think... firstly, I don't think anyone's been killed, and I haven't seen any major damage being done. I've seen a few kind of videos of a burning building on the side of a highway, but not what does not look like a military facility. From what I've seen, not that the Iranians, I don't think, would admit it.
No.
But I think what this is doing is this is allowing the Israelis to save a bit of face and to maybe push back for their own domestic purposes whilst not blowing the full thing over.
Yeah.
Because they put out a statement and they essentially said, this is our response to what you did to us, without recognising that Iran's response was something, was a response to something they did to them. Yeah. So again, very interesting. We'll have to see how it plays out. With all wars, though, the first casualty of war, Geordie, is the truth.
Yeah.
So
a cliche, but it's true.
It's a cliche, but it is true. So I just wanted to talk about quickly a journalist for the Grey Zone, Jeremy Lafredo, was arrested in Israel at a West Bank checkpoint with 4 other journalists. I thought this was quite interesting because he was arrested. I think they were kind of beaten and stuff like that.
Can I just add quickly?
Yeah, please.
This was last week, correct?
Yes.
And they were investigating the ballistic missile attack on Israel that Iran launched.
Yes.
They were looking at the facilities that had been damaged by those missiles.
Yes.
And there was, as you mentioned, other journalists with Jeremy.
Israeli journalists
with Jeremy, who works for the Grey Zone, obviously. And they were looking at this and the footage from this building, which I think was a Mossad building, I believe.
I believe so, or the Never Team Air Base, or one of these military installations.
Installations that they were viewing and looking at. And the Israeli press reported on this.
Yes.
As did Jeremy Lafayette for the Grey Zone.
Yes.
And he was detained while the others weren't.
Yes, correct. And so importantly, what ended up happening was a Israeli journalist actually because they're saying he essentially violated the military censor, because there is a full military censorship regime in Israel at the moment. So they were accusing him of essentially violating the censor and, supplying information to Iran or whatever, which is pretty obviously not true if you followed the Grayson's work or Jeremy Lafredo's work personally. However, what actually got him out of trouble at the end of the day, what got him released, was when he went to court in Israel, another journalist came out and said, I actually retweeted some of the stuff that he's posted before and I didn't get flagged. So how can you flag him? Yep. So they let him out. I've since seen him give interviews where he has discussed the whole thing in greater detail. Yeah. There was also a arrest in the UK of a British journalist, Asa Winstanley, who reports for the Electronic Intifada. So he was arrested under Section 1 and 2 of the Terrorism Act.
This is in Britain.
This is in Britain, yes, and detained. And he has always been a long-time supporter of the Palestinian resistance, as well as another one a couple months ago, Richard Medhurst, who we saw, who was arrested at Heathrow under the same laws, under the same offences, essentially.
Correct.
So I just wanted to bring that up because, the first casualty of war is the truth, and lots of these journalists who are doing really awesome work and are very popular and are spreading a word that is very contrary to the mainstream media narrative are getting penalised for it.
And alongside the truth is always a free and open press. They always, inside wars like this, target any sort of journalist, dissident journalists that report contrary to the kind of main popular narrative. So that's exactly what we're seeing in Britain, which we haven't seen in Australia yet, but
we've seen media attacks.
We have.
We've seen our obviously friend of the show, Habiba, how she has been targeted. However, we haven't seen any, since this has happened, specifically on this topic, any kind of legal actions brought against people. Obviously, you have Julian Assange, etc., hero. But so that's where we're at now. Fingers crossed, Geordie, with the upcoming US election, something would change. I don't think it will.
Yeah.
But it's always going to be interesting to see, for example, if we have a different change of president in the US, mate.
Speaking of different presidents,
let's end this on a light note.
I'm going to jump in and use this as a fantastic segue. I know you have and I have, but if anyone else has seen the interview that Joe Rogan did yesterday with Donald Trump.
Donald Trump,
And wow, that boy, oh boy. That
was a lot, wasn't it?
That interview demonstrated how irrelevant the establishment legacy media is. Completely irrelevant now. Within 24 hours, I think at 20 hours after that video was uploaded, it had 20 million views.
That's just on YouTube.
1 million views per hour on YouTube.
Not even including Spotify, which is where I listen to it. Wow, that's amazing.
And obviously, I know this is besides the point. It's always interesting, though. You can kind of like garnish the response to a video like that with someone that's obviously quite inflammatory, like Trump is, by the comment section. And I was quite shocked to see this kind of collective agreement inside the comment section, just saying like, this is actually fantastic to see former President Trump sit down with someone for 3 hours and not be attacked in a very biased kind of form, and just be able to sit there and have an open discussion. And props to Joe Rogan. You don't have to like him. He might not, interest you like his guests or what he talks about or any of his political views, but he's very good at interviewing people.
He is.
He's very good at sitting down and just letting people talk. And I think what Rogan does well is he does try and kind of press people a little bit when they sort of trail off or say something that doesn't necessarily mean much, or
he kind of redirects him into the right
redirects the conversation perfectly. And I think he did a good job with Trump in that instance. And boy, it was interesting. What I'd say Trump does really well is he doesn't sit down and coherently speak for a long period of time on one subject, which look, I think that works for American politics.
Yeah.
What he does really well is he's able to put kind of phrases and terms together very quickly in little rumbles, and he basically builds sound bites or reels as he speaks.
Yeah.
And it works really well.
He's a meme machine.
He's a
content
That's what he does.
machine,
Correct.
that man. Yeah.
That's exactly right. But what I think was interesting about it is that I don't think Kamala Harris could sit down and talk to someone like Joe Rogan for 3 hours like that.
No, I highly doubt it.
I don't think they're capable of it.
I highly doubt it.
And also, Trump was able to sit down. At about halfway through, as Rogan often does, they sort of derailed the conversation. So talking a little bit about MMA and the UFC and other things. No, what I found interesting was that Trump actually sat there and was able to engage and talk to him about those things.
Yes.
I think to kind of middle America, standard American voter or person that might not actually vote, who might listen to this podcast and now potentially go and vote, listening to the former president or politician sit down and talk about those things.
About a relatable topic.
In a kind of like wholesome, genuine manner. Mm-hmm. I think that connects with a lot more people inside America.
Absolutely, yeah.
And also, the one other thing I picked up on was Trump's talk about tariffs and protectionism, and I find that interesting because we've talked about this previously on the podcast, is he's really pushing to go back to a protectionist economic policy for America and to put massive tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles and other imports coming from overseas and from the European Union. And he also proposed to scrap all taxes on...
Or income tax, was it?
No, all taxes on tips. So he's proposed, because obviously American workers rely a lot on tips, that he will scrap all taxes for people working for tips.
So you can't raise the minimum wage.
And that's what I was thinking. You can't address the fact that their minimum wage is $7.50 an hour.
Federal minimum
hasn't
wage.
been raised in 20 years, but let's scrap taxes on tips, which he proposed, and then the Democrats and Kamala instantly picked up and put it as one of their policies.
Of course they did, yeah.
But what and this is what I've realized, he's really tapping into kind of like a populist economic, political, social sentiment in America that exists that we don't understand in Australia. Like, we just don't get that. And there's in some parallels to what happened in the Queensland election.
Yes, I think
some
so
parallels
as well.
there. But I think that's what he's doing really effectively. And that economic policy about kind of a protectionist tariff policy is, I think, aimed at people like Elon Musk and other major American manufacturers or corporations to protect them from competition from China.
Of course, yeah.
As we see, for example, Tesla is struggling to compete with BYD and other Chinese electric vehicles.
Of course.
And I think this policy is really used to obviously support American oligarchs, but potentially could also help bring back American manufacturing.
It could, yes.
And what I'd just say with that is that he has that policy, which is quite radical. It's not a kind of, a sort of free trade mantra, which we've seen for the past couple decades in America, but that vision and that policy is very different to anything else being put forwards by the Democrats or in America. So I found that very interesting and kind of a touch of sort of outside the kind of like accepted economic policy. Quite really different and almost a bit radical in that sense, because that's what China's used to build up their economy.
It is, and that's again, as Trump noted, that was what made the United States wealthy in the first place, essentially. Obviously, before the two world wars that destroyed Europe, which left them with economic primacy. But yeah, I think, like you said, he's very good at tapping into that kind of that everyman kind of discourse, you know what I mean? And I guess your average everyday person might hear, let's bring manufacturing back to America, and they're obviously going to think, that's awesome. They're not going to maybe put the two and two together that it was big business interests that impoverished them by looking for cheaper labour overseas for said manufacturing, but at least that's something that he can harness. And I think it'll be very interesting. I believe he has as well started to pull away quite significantly from Kamala. I know polls kind of don't necessarily mean much. And as we discussed earlier today, the popular vote doesn't mean anything either.
Because it comes down to the Electoral College.
Exactly.
Because I think it was Hillary Clinton, what was it, got how many more million votes?
Yeah, like a million extra or 2 million or something.
Yeah, and then the Electoral College still gave it in favour of Trump.
That's it. And look, as this progresses, we will be covering this very obscure topic that no one else in the media is going to cover. It's just a tiny little event, it doesn't affect anything. But we'll be continually reporting on that one.
Yeah.
So, interesting to see how the whole thing unfolds.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of things, especially stuff we were talking about earlier, geopolitically, lots of these things will hinge to a certain extent on what happens with the November election.
All right, mate, let's wrap it up.
Beautiful. Well, Geordie, thank you very much for a riveting episode of Left Hook Pod.
Thanks for joining us, and thanks for our audience for tuning in. As always, if you could like, subscribe, leave a comment, we'd appreciate it.
And we'll see you guys next time.
Have a great evening. See ya. Bye.
See ya.